From the Toronto Star, I'm Raju Mudler, and this matters. Friends. If there's one thing we've learned in this pandemic, it's who our close ones really are. Like that sitcom, our inner circle of close friends has never been tighter. But if we are talking in terms of that show, today we're not going to be talking about the main group. Today, we want to talk about Gunter. He's the guy who works at the coffee shop. And the point is, while this pandemic has affected our relationships with those closest to us, it's wiped out all of our small interactions with acquaintances, or people at work that we like to see but don't really work with. People like bartenders, or the baristas at the coffee shop. These interactions actually play a larger role in our social health and well-being than we think. Amanda Mull is a staff writer at The Atlantic who wrote a great piece looking at what we lose when our casual relationships are disrupted. She joins us to talk about it. Amanda, thank you so much for taking the time to join us.
Thank you for having me.
Okay, Amanda, I basically miss everybody right now. And there are so many fascinating things in your piece that I really want to get to, but I also think it's kind of fitting that the day after the Super Bowl, we're talking. Because as I read, it seemed like the inspiration for this piece was you missing watching sports in a bar, which is something that you do with friends, but also with a group of strangers. What is it that you miss?
Yes, I'm a big football fan, mostly college football, a little bit of NFL. And I realized after a while that that is one of the defining social activities of much of my year during football season. And I just realized that there's something about the energy of being in a crowd of people who are all having the same feelings and want the same thing and are just keyed into the same emotional wavelength. There is something profoundly psychologically satisfying about that. And I've been able to keep a little bit of that energy in my life by watching football outdoors, weather permitting, with a couple of close friends. But you really just don't get the full experience unless there's a lot of people.
This pandemic has really shown us what we've taken for granted, and it obviously has shrunken our worlds. And so, I think the thing with your story that was so great is that it talks about what happens when we lose the acquaintances, the crossing guard, the bartender, and how much is lost when we don't have those ties. Now, you looked at a ton of the research, and this is called weak ties in the study of friendships and relationships. Can you just tell us a little bit about that before we get into it?
Yes. What I found is that for much of human social history, sociologists and social scientists believed that what humans needed for well-being, psychological, physical well-being, were their closest ties, their very best friends, their close family, their romantic partners, people like that. And then in the 70s, a sociologist at Stanford looked into what people actually get from the different people in their lives and the different roles that they play, and found pretty convincing evidence that psychologically humans really, really need a variety of types of social ties. And he specifically singled out weak ties, which are people on the periphery of your social life mostly. So everybody knows what an inner circle is. He posited that there is also an equally valuable outer circle. Those are your barista at your local coffee shop who knows your order, your local bartenders, the people you see at work but don't work with directly. So maybe somebody in a different department that you chat with in the kitchen while you're waiting to heat up your lunches.
Hi, Stretch. What's the good word?
My name is Grimes, Simpson, Frank Grimes. I took the trouble to learn your name. The least you can do is learn mine.
Okay, Grimey.
They're your neighbors. There are all kinds of people throughout your life that you interact with in some capacity on a daily basis, but that you don't necessarily know their names, or you might not know their last name. You don't necessarily know how to get in contact with them. They're the social interactions and relationships that sort of take place out in the world instead of the ones that we keep close track of and that take place within our homes emotionally between two people as a result of intentional interaction instead of incidental.
So this was posited by a Stanford sociologist, Mark Granovetter, and he basically found that while these are the relationships and small interactions we really don't think very much about, they can actually have a big impact, like he found on your career, right?
Right. The way that Granovetter first went about establishing the importance of these kinds of ties, we're looking at how people get jobs. And in his initial study back in the 70s, he found that I think it was 84% of people who found jobs through their social networks found them through weak ties instead of through their close family and friends. And that sort of demonstrates, I think, what the importance of weak ties is. They give you variety. They bring new information, new opportunities, other new people. They're the thing that tethers you to the world at large. And being tethered to that wider community, to that wider set of people, can bring about opportunities that you might not have been aware of otherwise. And that is true socially, but it's also true professionally.
One of the lines that I really loved from your piece was from another researcher. Friend is a very promiscuous word. He's basically talking about how we don't really delineate between people who we consider our friends. What was he trying to get at in terms of these weak tie relationships?
Yes, this is one of my favorite conversations that I had for this piece. It was with William Rawlins, who's a professor at Ohio University who studies friendship. One of my goals in this was trying to figure out what you call these people and if we have a word for them. And the point that he was making is that we don't really have a word for anybody besides friend.
Watch it, bud. Who you going, bud, pal? Who you calling pal, friend? Who you going, friend, jackass?
Acquaintance sort of works, but some of your weak ties and some of the types of people that we're missing right now are closer to us than acquaintances. They're people whose friendship you really value and who you know, but maybe those relationships just involve doing stuff out in the world together instead of, long talks on the phone. There's no real word that encapsulates all of these different types of relationships except for friend. And his point with that was that it's good that we don't have all these different hierarchical concepts to rank our friends, basically, because that sort of misunderstands the value that all these different types of people can bring to us. And so he was sort of against the idea that we need to understand all of these different people and their roles in our lives in a way that attaches vocabulary to them. And really, he said, and I agree with this argument ultimately, that it's more valuable to understand that all of the people that we encounter are important to us and important to our psychological health, important to our physical health, and bring great value into our lives, whether they're the person who makes your coffee or one of your closest friends. I think it's useful to be reminded of that by just acknowledging that all of these people are our friends.
We'll be right back. Okay, Amanda, I used to work as an editor, and while I was reading your piece, I was shocked that no one wanted to subtitle it, "If you don't engage in small talk, the terrorists win." Now, that's an oversimplification. But basically, one of the things that you write about is that people who close themselves off from the world are the people that are more easily radicalized, right? But I think the larger thing of that is because people on the periphery of our lives are the ones that often challenge us and make us think a little bit differently. Right? Like, can we talk about those things and this idea first about the radicalization, but also about what, I guess, the people we don't see all that often bring to us?
Right. The people on the periphery of our lives are more likely than those closest to us to have different ideas about things, to have different types of information, to have different points of view on life, to have different experiences than our own. And being in contact with people like that is very, very important for us to feel connected to people that we think are different than us, to feel that we have some sort of mutual goals with them and that they're actually not that different from us after all. One of the researchers I spoke to mentioned that when you are only around people who are exactly like you, who have the same beliefs as you, who reinforce those beliefs and with certainty all the time, that can lead people to radicalize, which is basically to become sure and sure of more and more extreme beliefs. So when you lose your tether to the wider community at large and to the people around you who may not be exactly the same as you or may not have similar life experiences to you, it's easy to fall into this sort of spiral of extremism. And when you have all of those contacts cut off sort of unceremoniously and all at once, that can be a profoundly destabilizing situation for people. You lose support, you lose the sense of belonging to the larger world. And I think that then a lot of people who feel unstable, who feel like they need support, like they need certainty, go looking for it. And a lot of them, especially, in this situation, do so on the internet. That can be effective for people. Maybe you find a group that wants to talk about baseball and that's your favorite sport. Maybe you find a group that does the same hobby as you, knitting, something like that. And those can be beneficial, stabilizing, comforting sources of social support in a time like this. A lot of the social platforms that we use for pursuing these kinds of social interactions online have algorithms that sort of act in particular ways that may not be in the best interest of the people using them. You see this with Facebook a lot, that a lot of their recommendations tend to be political and they tend to be sort of extreme. And this is like a known problem within Facebook. They know that their algorithm does this. So if you were a person who is reading election news or something like that, for instance, Facebook is then incentivized to give you more and more extreme content because that's what spurs interaction. That's what encourages people to keep clicking, to keep interacting, to comment on things, to share things. So you end up in these sort of extreme realms of thought that are self-reinforcing. They're large groups of people who all believe the same sort of extreme things and who share misinformation and disinformation freely. And you end up with a really toxic information environment that provides certainty, that provides social support, that provides a sense of belonging, which are social dynamics that people are really seeking out right now, which is how you get the sort of astronomical growth of things like QAnon.
One of the other interesting ideas that you bring up is conversational reciprocity, which really actually does speak to the power of small talk, right?
Right. Conversational reciprocity is a really interesting dynamic that I think that once people understand what it means, they can sort of see it around them and see it especially in their workplaces. I talked to one researcher who is studying this currently, and he recently published a paper about how this goes in workplaces, which is an environment in which you often have one person instructing another person on how to do a task.
Hello, Peter. What's happening? We have sort of a problem here. Yeah, you apparently didn't put one of the new cover sheets on your TPS reports.
Oh, yeah. I'm sorry about that. I forgot.
Yeah. You see, we're putting the cover sheets on all TPS reports now before they go out. Did you see the memo about this?
And these sorts of interactions are sort of inherently unbalanced, where you get one person talking a lot and another person just receiving instruction. And what he found is that in situations where that dynamic exists, if people have unstructured time, those interactions end up balancing themselves out. The person who is lower on the totem pole and is receiving instruction tends to put in their 2 cents, provide feedback, and sort of balance the interaction so both parties feel like they've been heard. And that ends up with people feeling happier and more satisfied about completing the task afterward. And this happens sort of naturally in office environments, in workplace environments, as long as they're healthy environments. Where it doesn't really happen naturally is on Zoom and other types of video conferencing software. Because when you schedule something and you know who the participants are and you know what the subject of the conversation is, you come in with very specific ideas about who's going to be doing the talking, who's going to be listening, and when that interaction is going to be over. So you don't really get the reciprocity that you would have in an in-person interaction, and you don't really have like the casual time to like maybe get a coffee afterwards or something like that and chat about how things would go that way. So you end up sort of in a situation that is very transactional. People don't like that. Nobody likes that. Bosses don't like that, usually, in a healthy workplace. So I think doing this for a year has hurt morale in a lot of ways for people at work. Even workplaces that are still functioning, I think people are starting to get a little bit testy with each other, just because this sort of like natural human balancing act is out of whack. And there's no really obvious way to put it back in order. Just we don't have the tools that facilitate this kind of interaction.
You mentioned Zoom, and you've already mentioned some of the toxic things about social media, but I do find it really interesting because these networks, these social media networks, they do help people connect. It's just not the same, at least to me. Am I just an old fart for thinking that? Saying that I want the IRL interactions and I miss them? Because I wonder about young people now who are coming of age in this and whether it's going to be a Zoom world for them from now on. Do they realize what they're missing, do you think?
I think that they do realize it. And all of the experts I spoke with said that these types of tools can be profoundly useful in a situation like the one that we're in now, in keeping people tethered to others and providing people with an outlet and providing people with an opportunity to feel like they're still participating in the world. Like you said, they do have some downsides. They cannot recreate everything that makes human social interaction beneficial. One of the researchers I spoke with said that the value of in-person interaction is, to a great extent, just being perceived and confirmed and having your humanity reflected back at you. And that can happen in just like a little chat with a cashier when you buy lunch. And it happens for the cashier in that moment too. If you have, as someone who has worked customer service for years in the past, having nice customers who smile and ask how you're doing is like great. It can make the difference in how your day goes, totally. And I think it can make the difference for people patronizing those businesses too. And I think that those types of interactions are things that we took for granted. And they're the types of interactions that can't be digitally recreated. You can't have that nice little chat doing curbside pickup. You can't have that nice little chat when somebody's leaving something outside of your door for you. You know, you strip out all the humanity from those human interactions and it's just the transaction left. So while the digital tools we have are good for keeping the world churning in some sense, there's just things you miss.
Now, here's the other thing. All the other researchers, it seemed to talk to, were really hoping that as we come out of this, as you know, we get vaccines, as we hit our roaring 20s, new roaring 20s that are going to come, that we start to really think about our friendships and our relationships with all those people and not take it for granted. How do we do that?
Like you said, all of the researchers I spoke with were hopeful that this sort of prolonged absence of all of these weak ties helps us understand exactly how valuable people are to our lives, and especially people that do kinds of labor that our culture doesn't really value, like people who work in customer service, people who work in restaurants, people who work in coffee shops, delivery guys, people like that. All of the work that they do and their humanity in doing it is vitally important for the society we live in. And it's very, very easy to dismiss their role in our lives. Hopefully, when we're able to return to some of our normal interactions with people again, we don't forget how lonely it felt to be without them. We don't forget how much we were lacking when we didn't have those people in our lives. And hopefully it helps us just revalue and reorder how we think about who matters to us, who brings value to our life, and how we should perhaps treat them as a result.
I think the thing that I really loved about your piece was that it made me think about some people that I hadn't been thinking about, as I've been concerned about, obviously, you know, my close friends, my older parents, and trying to juggle family, friends, and all that on Zoom calls and stuff like that. So I think a great line to sort of end on is we should just all remember to be kind to each other. Amanda, I really, really want to thank you for your time and discussing this with us today.
Yes, thank you so much for having me.
Amanda Mull is a staff writer at The Atlantic. That's it for today. Thanks so much for joining us. This Matters is hosted and produced by me, Raji Mudler, Adrian Chung, and Saba Etizaz. Produced and mixed by Sean Pattenden, and our director of programming is JP Foso. Our show theme music is by So Called, and our episode music is by Mike DeAngelis. We want to hear what stories matter to you. Please send us comments, questions, or ideas to thismatters@thestar.ca. Please consider supporting the journalism the Toronto Star newsroom does at thestar.com. And don't forget to subscribe to This Matters on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, or wherever you listen to your favorite podcasts. Let's talk soon.